So let's come to the third of these liberating understandings. The teaching of Anatta. All conditioned phenomena are empty of self, are empty of an independent self-existence. That includes us. Now, I think this is this is an aspect of the teaching that people tell me they often struggle with, that feels mysterious, it doesn't make immediate sense. I mean, we know about Dukkha, we didn't need the Buddha to tell us this, We know about change, we didn't need the Buddha to tell us about this. And then suddenly the Buddha comes along with this proposal that everything that is born is empty of an independent self-existence. And somehow we feel, I don't know what to do with that teaching. One thing, well, just as a starting point, the Buddha did not teach no self, okay? It's so important to recognize. He taught about non-self, not no self, non-self. So that's a good starting point. Now, one of the reasons that it feels, I think, so puzzling is that we certainly feel to be a self. You wake up in the morning and who's waiting for you? Me. And I kind of slip into me like a comfortable old pair of slippers, and I go in the bathroom and look in the mirror, and who's looking back? Well, we'd be very surprised if it was Jimi Hendrix or, Bugs Bunny, Oh, it's me. There I am. Good morning, me. And we go out into our day, into my life, which is an extension of me. So then we hear this possibility of there's actually no pilot in the cockpit. There is actually non-self. So to be clear about really, the Buddha was not interested in getting rid of the self. He was interested in ending distress. He was interested in ending suffering and ending struggle, and how much of that struggle and distress in our lives can be traced back to the investment we have in being a me. And a certain kind of me, which is different than you, the me. So the Buddha was not interested in getting rid of the self. And, you're going to have a self as long as you live, I hope. He talks about a navigational self, We need a navigational self, So we get up, we know which car is ours, we know who our children are, we know who we're married to or not married to, we know where we live. Navigational selves are great, really handy things to have. You could imagine if you didn't have a navigational self, how lost you would be. The Buddha also speaks about wholesome identity. There's a discourse titled What is to be Cultivated, in which the Buddha very much speaks about cultivating identities that lead towards a greater sense of freedom and understanding and clarity, cultivating identities that lead us to flourish, that lead away from confusion, that bring meaningfulness to our lives. And not cultivating identities in which we do not flourish, that are not rooted in ethics, that lead towards more distress and towards more suffering. This is also a helpful hint, And again, this is important in our lives, isn't it? To have that discernment, to know which identities are to be cultivated. And they may be quite fluid. I have a number of different identities in my life. And they're quite fluid. When I go to the supermarket, I don't give Dharma talks. When I play with my grandchildren, I can play. I have a number of different identities in my life. Hopefully when I teach, I'm not a grandmother, So, they're appropriate to the moment, and they're fluid. They're appropriate to the moment, and they're fluid. They're not static, they're not constant. They are appropriate to the moment. These are not issues. the navigational self, the appropriate identities, these are not issues. They don't lead to distress or suffering or being tied to repetitive cycles. So the Buddhist describes this middle path of having this navigational self, knowing what identities are quite useful, and then actually looking at what is not useful and what is not helpful. And what is not helpful or useful is being tied to a view of self which is static and centralized, which is surrounded by confusion, which is born of clinging, and which is carrying the vehicle for carrying the whole package of unwholesome sankharas that really do not serve us well. When actually you look at a view of self, it's actually a construction of sankharas. It's a construction of patterns. There's a wonderful teaching of the Buddha where he says, what we frequently think about and dwell upon becomes the shape of our mind. That is a sankhara. And the shape of our mind becomes the shape of ourself, and the shape of ourself becomes the shape of our world. So these are the sankharas out of which we construct a view of self. So what did the Buddha say about views of self? He said, views of self are a vexation. Views of self are a contraction. Views of self are an inflammation. Views of self are an irritation. So, when you look at what is the opposite of anatta, it is atta. It is a solid, centralized, seemingly static view about who you are. Some of this is inherited. So actually, often a lot begins as an inheritance. You have people in your lives telling you, parents, educators, telling you who you are. You're good at this, or you're a bit of a failure, or you're wonderful, or you're pretty annoying, or you have views of self which are inherited. Sometimes they're generational, that you're not very worthy. And we have views of self that are constructed. So views of self have a very familiar narrative. This is me, this is mine, this is who I am. Now, let's look at the ways that views of self are constructed. So, if I was to invite you to write a short autobiography, beginning each sentence with I am. This is Sakaya Ditti in Pali, personality view or views of self. Now think about what your autobiography would look like. How much of it is kind of appreciating things about yourself? And how much of your autobiography is about a list, a short list or a long list of all your faults? Now that short autobiography is what we call personality view or Sakaya Ditti. It's shaped by the way that we identify with the body, with feelings, with perceptions, with emotional and psychological patterns or sankharas, or consciousness. So think of what that looks like. I'm ill, I'm young, I'm old, I'm attractive, I'm afraid, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm excited, I'm depressed, I'm an aversive type, I'm a greedy type, I'm a deluded type. I am my thoughts. I am my mind. Now, Sakaya Ditti is pretty unreliable, isn't it? I mean, do you have the same view of self right now as you woke up with this morning. You know, sometimes at breakfast we got pretty grumpy self. Yeah. Lunchtime, I'm kind of happy. You know, dinner time, oh no, I'm really exhausted. You know, I don't have the energy for this anymore. Notice how many views of self you have in a single day. Conditioned by mood, shaped by emotion, shaped, it seems, by the world of conditions around us, shaped by something that's happening in the body. It's very fluid, isn't it? And yet it carries an amazing sense of amnesia. So the happy self at lunchtime has entirely forgotten the grumpy self at breakfast. You know, this is my real self. This is who I am. You know, the kind of a, you know, exhausted, weary, bored sense at dinner time, completely forgotten the happy self. You know, there's a strong sense of amnesia, rather than seeing impermanence within personality view. We actually get forgetfulness. Because each view of self seems very true, doesn't it? Seems very lasting, you know, it seems very enduring, it feels very solid, you know, like this is the real me, you know, this is who I really am. Completely forgetful. The agitated me can't remember the contented me. Views of self are convincing. They're authoritative. This is who I am. This is who I will always be. In my younger years, you know, along with countless others, we went to India in search of our true selves. And I never met anybody who was successful. It was true in 1 minute, wasn't true in the next minute. But we can be enchanted by our views. If you give a mirror to a gorilla, they look at the mirror and then they look behind it to see who's there. If you give a mirror to a human being, they look at it and say, there I am. Yeah? They don't look behind it. Now, the Buddha directly associated these personality views as being one of the central causes of distress in our lives. It's kind of like within those personality views, there's a craving for a continued me, the eternal me. And all of the other compulsions of craving, according to the Buddha, arise from the central craving for a present and future me. Views of self are very central to all the ways that we endeavor to control our world, rearrange conditions to support the continuity of that me, to have maximum pleasure and minimum discomfort, because I don't like the uncomfortable. Yeah? I don't like the uncomfortable. Pleasure supports me, doesn't it? If I've got a maximum amount of pleasure in my life, you know, I'm doing great. I'm successful. You know, things are really working out for me. You know, and you know, I've really zinging, you know, winging this. You know, if we've got a lot of discomfort in our life, what does that say about me? You know, I haven't tried hard enough, or I'm not as successful as others. You know, I need to try harder. It's pretty almost impossible to discern any difference between clinging and selfing. And I use the word selfing very specifically because this is a process just like anything else. It's not that I cling. Isn't that interesting? You know, I don't cling to things. That's another self story. You know? It is actually clinging that gives birth to the idea of self. And the idea that I cling is another confused notion of autonomy that we attribute to the centralized self, which is why I also don't let go. A world, a self-view that is founded upon clinging is a very fragile world. It doesn't take much to get it knocked off balance. It will be upset by change. It will be upset by impermanence. And these personality views are deeply upset by what the Buddha calls the 8 worldly winds: praise and blame, success and failure, loss and gain, judgment and being applauded. The centralized view of self is deeply upset by what it's called the worldly winds. If we see that clinging and selfing cause distress and contractedness, there's a real question of why don't we apply the liberating understanding of impermanence to views of self? Why do we somehow believe that this is outside of the laws of change and impermanence? Now, the formation of personality view, of views of self, can't be separated from the ways that we invest self in others. Now, you'll notice that there's two words that you probably will have come across. Anatta, which is non-self, and shunyata, which is the emptiness of self in all things. Okay? So contemplating anatta, non-self within this being, is a direct way of contemplating shunyata, or the emptiness of self, independent self-existence in all things. There's no abiding self-existence in anything. So this becomes, when we go out into the world, we see flower, we see tree, we see grass, we see bird, we see people. And there's an ongoing, almost invisible process happening in our perceptions where we are solidifying self through unquestioned perception. So we see bird and it has a certain association for us. It has a memory, a historical memory to it. You see a person you haven't seen in 5 years, and you only need to see them, and you have a perception, and with that perception comes all of not only the memory, but the emotional memory of, whether I like that person or don't like that person, whether they upset me or reinforce me. So perception, when it is distorted, is constantly positing a certain solidity and independent self-existence in all things. Does that make sense to you? So going back to that formula, what we contact through our sense doors, there is feeling, Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, neither. What we feel, we perceive. What we perceive, we think about. What we think about, we proliferate about. What we proliferate about becomes a shape of our mind, and the shape of our mind forms our view of self. It's the way it is, and that is how we view the world. This is something that we can trace moment to moment. This is how this personality view keeps changing. Because we keep having different moments of contact throughout our day, different Vedana tones, feeling tones, different perceptions that we then think about and have stories about, and that shapes our view of self of the moment. This is personality view. It is something that is born, and it often changes because we make contact with something else. So I've had a certain contact, I've woken up this morning, I've got sort of an unpleasant email, I perceive it, I proliferate about it, I've got a shape of mind and a shape of self, oh no, that person really dislikes me, I'm really unlikable. We can carry that personality view around for a little while, until we get our wonderful croissant and cup of coffee, and suddenly, oh gosh, another contact, another feeling tone, another perception, all is well in the world, I'm pretty happy right now, I'm pretty contented, until another contact moment comes along. You see that happening through the day, that one view of self is getting kind of pushed off the shelf because of contact with something else that is the beginning of forming another view of self that seems so convincing, completely forgotten about the previous one, and now we have arrived, we've landed in this view of self. Now, views of self are really significant to investigate because it's not like they're passive, are they? We act out our views of self. This is what we bring into the world. This is what we bring into relationship. This is what influences our sense of aspiration. If we've got a more repetitive view, the more a view of self repeats itself, by the way, the more convincing it becomes. So if I've got a pretty repetitive view of self, that I'm a bit of a failure in this life and not up to it and not quite worthy, what's that going to do to your life? To your sense of aspiration, to what you think is possible for you, to how much confidence you feel in the choices you make? Or is it going to bring about a sense of impossibility? In the Buddhist teachings, it's really, this is why the Buddha was mystified, why people found the teaching of Anatta so daunting. Because he says, just look at your own experience. Look at your own experience in a single day, sometimes in a single hour, how your view of self is changing, being shaped and reshaped, formed and reformed. And it's really hard to find anything there that is static or lasting. When we repeat views of self again quite a lot, they seem even more true. And then they shape our thoughts, they shape our narratives, they shape our speech, they shape our sense of possibility or impossibility. And the Buddha put it so simply that Sakkaya Ditthi, or personality view, is born of clinging. It's born of clinging, born of grasping. This is what gives rise to personality view. And clinging is no more than a magnification of craving and aversion. And clinging turns process into something that appears far more static and enduring. Clinging turns self from a verb into a noun, into the I am. If we're able to calm the agitations of craving and aversion, we're much more able to calm the agitation of clinging. And if we're able to calm the agitation of clinging, we will form no views of self. That is the freedom. That is the freedom. We will still move through life. We will still have a navigational self. We will still have, senses of identity that help us to aspire and to embody, but we will have no center of me. If we're able to calm the agitations of craving and aversion, we will calm the agitation of clinging. If we're able to calm the agitation of clinging, we will form no views of self. So the task or the invitation seems rather evident, doesn't it? Seems rather evident. So it begins in these kind of, movements that we become so intimate with and so aware of, these movements towards, these movements from away from, these movements of craving, these movements of aversion. This is our starting point. If we can begin to calm that, through disenchantment, through understanding impermanence, through understanding dukkha, if we can begin to calm those agitations, it doesn't move into that contracting and clinging and grasping, and there is no formation of views of self. We could kind of stop there, couldn't we? That's kind of the path. That is the path. And it's the little ones that make a difference. It's the little cravings, the little aversions. It all actually matters. Now, the other part is that we are not always clinging or creating views of self. There are countless moments in your day when there is no clinging. There may be countless moments in your day when you're not caught in a contracted view of I am. Have you ever noticed the moments when you're just kind of mindful of breathing and the breather's not home? When you can actually look at a flower wholeheartedly without there being any kind of judgment or, liking or not liking, but a heartfelt sense of appreciation. Have you ever noticed yourself being able to listen to another person without the filters of wanting or not wanting or selfing? Have you ever brushed your teeth without being the brusher? And have you noticed the difference between those moments and when a view of self is operating? Take something so utterly simple like brushing your teeth. When the brusher is present, am I doing it right? Are they white enough? Oh, that tooth's not very good. Oh no, I love that. You've got a view of self right there. You listen to another person without the wholeheartedness, and you can see the view of self interpreting, what does this mean to me? What does this say about me? What should I say in response? You can feel the difference. So not to assume that clinging is permanent. It is not. It is something that arises and passes. Not assuming that views of self are ever present. They are not. There are plenty of gaps, and sometimes they quite surprise us, don't they? Because they're moments of peace. They're moments of peace. They're moments of well-being. They're characterized by, an absence of struggle and tension, comparing and judging. Sometimes we walk in nature and we just see and we just listen. And we notice those moments. It's really important to notice those moments because they give us some ground in which to reflect the moments when craving and aversion and clinging is much more on the move. To sensitize ourselves to those moments. You see this so experientially. You may sit and there's a pain in the body, and it's real, it's not imagined. But you can see the moment that pain is met with aversion, how quickly it moves into, I am the body. I am the sufferer. I am the owner of this pain. But met with mindfulness and curiosity and kindness, it's pain. It's not who I am. It is pain. Feeling tones move through our consciousness every moment, pleasant and unpleasant. Met with aversion or craving, what happens? They're turned into, I want, I need, I can't bear this, I'm afraid, I'm greedy. Perceptions arise and pass. When they're loaded with emotional memory and association, I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy. I'm an irritated type. To see how quickly all of this can happen moment to moment in our experience. But it's not always the case. You can see sometimes you're sitting, you're practicing, and a difficult thought arises, a difficult memory arises. And sometimes it sticks, and another time it doesn't stick at all. What's the difference? Not the contents, but the climate in which those contents arise. Climate of mind. And a lot of meditation practice is really concerned with cultivating the non-sticky mind. The non-sticky mind. Yes, in which there can be that arising of the lovely and the unlovely without the contractedness around it. Now, how are we doing for time? Been going for an hour. Anybody feeling stiff? Uncomfortable? You're all just chilled out? Just relax? Oh, good. Now, the Buddha proposed a sustained application of certain questions, and this is what he proposed to his son, Rahula, who brought to him the question of how to cultivate this non-sticky climate of mind. And the Buddha says, meet all things with this, being able to say to yourself, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, this is not who I am, to all experience. And it's not just a verbal repetition, but an ongoing challenging of clinging. He proposed this as a way to become disenchanted with clinging and disenchanted with views of self. I think, anatta is not, understanding anatta is not necessarily some great mystical experience. There's something really moment to moment incredibly practical about all this. Unpacking views. To unpack our views requires some stillness, it requires investigation. And the Buddha would often, use this example of the ox cart. Probably many of you are familiar with this. He said, if you have an ox cart and you look at it and you say, that is surely an ox cart, and he says, okay, dismantle it, take it apart, unpack it, take it all to pieces. He says, look at the wheels, is that the ox cart? And you say, that's not the ox cart, You say, look at the shaft, is that the ox cart? That's not the ox cart, Look at the wood, is that the ox cart? No, that's not the ox cart. He said, there is no independent self-existence. You put all of this together and you put a name upon it, and you've got an ox cart that you mistake as being having an ongoing solidity and an eternal self within it. I mean, think about yourself, We're not going to dismember ourselves, but if we're to do, is that hand myself? No. When you clip your toenails, do you look at the clippings on the floor and grieve and say, I've lost part of myself, you go to the hairdresser, you get your hair cut, you say, oh no, myself is getting cut off. You don't. It's all of this together, isn't it? And you put a name on it, and the name gets mistaken for the reality. The name comes to represent all things. This is what the Buddha calls a nimitta, or a sign. And it's part of our languaging, isn't it? That we put a name upon all things. Flower, bird, chair, airplane, sun. We put a name upon all things, and that name comes to signify the totality or the reality of that perception. In truth, a name cannot do that, can it? Put a name upon, Fred. Well, Fred, then immediately in my mind, Fred is like this and like that and like this. But Fred is only capturing a fragment of who Fred is. Can never capture the fullness. But we mistake the nimitta, the sign, as a way of knowing, as a way of finding certainty, as a way of finding safety and predictability, as a way of arguing with dukkha. We have a name and we become satisfied. But then we don't see the fullness of Fred. We never see the fullness of Fred. I think of the simile of the raft. And the Buddha says, a person needing to cross a great expanse of water, the near shore dangerous, and the far shore safe and free from fear. The person builds a raft and crosses, thinks, this raft has been so helpful to me, so maybe I should also hoist it on my head and carry it with me wherever I go. Not helpful. Perhaps to put the raft down. Navigational self is helpful, but views of self are not helpful. And there may be the opportunity and the possibility of putting them down, and what happens then? You have the possibility of being the fluid, changing, unfolding, dynamic person you have the possibility of being. You are not fixed. You are not static.